Welcome class to chapter 9. This chapter in physiology is all about the neural control of involuntary effectors. So we're really going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system and things that happen automatically in your body without you having any voluntary control over them. So autonomic neurons are composed of the brain and spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord will receive input from sensory neurons and direct activity of motor neurons that innervate muscles and glands. And again, this is all autonomic or automatic control. Association neurons will integrate sensory information and help to direct the appropriate response to maintain homeostasis and respond to the environment. A little difference between the somatic and autonomic. Somatic motor neurons have cell bodies in the spinal cord and just one neuron traveling from the spinal cord to the effector, whereas in the autonomic motor system has two sets of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. The first has cell bodies in the brain or spinal cord and synapses in an autonomic ganglion, and the second has cell bodies in the ganglion and synapses on the effector. Autonomic neurons, we call them preganglionic or postganglionic neurons. The preganglionic will originate in the midbrain or hindbrain or from the thoracic, lumbar, or sacral spinal cord, and postganglionic neurons will originate in ganglion. They're located in the head, the neck, and the abdomen, as well as in chains in the sympathetic trunk along either side of the spinal cord. So this is looking at the autonomic nervous system and how it has pre- and postganglionic neurons. And again, a ganglia is any kind of bulge of cell bodies where there would be some sort of synapse occurring. So here are the preganglionic neurons synapsing on the autonomic ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron taking the motor response to some sort of involuntary effector. Visceral effector organs are somewhat independent of innervation and will not atrophy if a nerve is cut, unlike skeletal muscle. So the target may become even more sensitive to stimulation. Cardiac muscle and some smooth muscle contract rhythmically without nerve stimulation. Autonomic innervation can speed up or slow down these contractions. So your cardiac muscle cells can actually control its own heartbeat. So your heart can establish its own heartbeat. And if you would remove a heart from the body, the heart would continue beating for a little bit. Autonomic motor neurons can stimulate or inhibit depending on the organ and the receptors. So we'll talk about neurotransmitters. Somatic motor neurons release only acetylcholine, which is always excitatory. And remember, somatic motor neurons always go to muscle cells, and acetylcholine is the main and only neurotransmitter that's needed for muscle cell contraction, skeletal muscle cell contraction. Autonomic neurons will release mainly acetylcholine, but also norepinephrine, and they can be excitatory or inhibitory. That means they can stimulate a response in the effector, or they can inhibit it. So this is a comparison of the two systems and this feature of the two, and this is a good chart to look at. Divisions of your ANS. The preganglionic neurons come from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, so we call this the thoracocolumnar division. And preganglionic neurons will synapse in the sympathetic ganglia that run parallel to the spinal cord. That's called the sympathetic trunk, if you guys remember learning that in anatomy. By week 4 after conception, there's 3 distinct swellings, and they're seen on the neural tube. And these swellings are called, eventually they'll become the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. So this is a look at the sympathetic trunk and the sympathetic ganglion, and this is just where the preganglionic neurons will synapse. And you can see here how they will synapse off of branches that are coming off of the spinal cord. Convergence and divergence. Because these preganglionic neurons can branch and synapse in ganglia at any level, there is divergence, which was when they diverge. So one preganglionic neuron will synapse on several postganglionic neurons, or they will converge, where you have several preganglionic neurons at different levels when they'll synapse on one postganglionic neuron. And this just allows the sympathetic division to act as a single unit through mass activation, which is very important. So this is a look at some sympathetic neuron pathways. Again, A motor pathway will always come out of the ventral root of the spinal cord, and this synapse you can see whenever you see kind of a solid line, that's a preganglionic neuron, and connected to a solid line would be a little space and then a dotted line in the postganglionic neuron. And you can see here where those ganglia will be, any sort of bulge in the nerve pathway will be where a ganglia is, and this will be where a preganglionic neuron will synapse with a postganglionic neuron. Collateral ganglia, there's other ganglia throughout the body, and I'll let you read through where they would be located. And this is some of the other places where other collateral sympathetic ganglia are located. And again, these ganglia are where preganglionic neurons synapse with postganglionic neurons. And again, these synapses in the ganglia are important because it allows for very direct and unique and specific control of different areas of the nervous system. Adrenal glands, the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine when stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, so it helps in your fight or flight and stress response. So this is a look at the sympathetic division, the part of the body innervated, and where the origin of those fibers will come from. Preganglionic neurons come from the brain or sacral region of the spinal cord in the parasympathetic division, so we call it the craniosacral division. And these will synapse on ganglia located near or in the effector organs called terminal ganglia. Cranial nerves and the parasympathetic division, these are the cranial nerves associated with the parasympathetic division. And I do kind of want you guys to know these nerves, the oculomotor nerve and what it will do. It'll innervate the ciliary muscle of the eye. So it's just one of the motor nerves that stimulates the eye muscles. Facial nerves, the facial nerves synapse and stimulate salivary glands and lacrimal glands. Remember, the parasympathetic is your rest and digest division, so it'll be helpful in digestion. The glossopharyngeal will also innervate some salivary glands, and then the vagus nerve will travel to ganglia within effector organs in the heart, your lungs, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, liver, and intestines. And this is the path of the vagus nerve. It's the one cranial nerve that actually exits out of the face region and travels down into the thoracic cavity and even the abdominal cavity. So it's the only cranial nerve that travels that far south, you could say. The more of the parasympathetic division, this is where the sacral nerves and what they will innervate. And then this is just a summary of the parasympathetic division. Again, a good chart to maybe kind of summarize the information found in the previous couple slides. This just gives you a comparison of your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And again, the parasympathetic is often known as the craniosacral division. So the parasympathetic is in blue, and the sympathetic division is also known as your thoracolumbar division, and it is in red. And again, the sympathetic division is the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic division is the rest and digest division. So they'll innervate organs associated with those effects. So some functions of your ANS, and this actually takes us through what the sympathetic functions are. And I'm going to let you guys read through some of this on your own. But your sympathetic division activates the body for fight or flight, so it'll release norepinephrine. It prepares the body for intense physical activity and emergency, so it'll increase your heart rate, increase your blood glucose levels to provide sugar and glucose to create ATP, the energy that your body needs. And it'll regulate heart, blood vessels, and other organs. So I do want you guys to know really well the functions of both of these divisions. I will ask you questions about their functions. The parasympathetic is antagonistic. It's the rest and digest. Through the release of acetylcholine, it will slow the heart rate down and increase digestive activities. So this is a look, and again, I know it's hard to read these, but it's actually, it's good to read the organ and then the action of the organ and the effect, and tell what the organ does, if it's a sympathetic or parasympathetic effect. And I would encourage you to read through this, especially knowing what happens to the muscle in your eyes, in which the sympathetic will dilate the pupil, the parasympathetic will constrict the pupil, your sympathetic will increase heart rate, vasoconstrict the blood vessels. So knowing some of these effects of the parasympathetic and sympathetic are important. This looks at adrenergic and cholinergic synaptic transmission. Cholinergic or cholinergic synaptic transmission is where acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter in both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I'll let you guys read through these synapses, but these synapses are called cholinergic. Adrenergic synaptic transmission is when we use norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter in most sympathetic. And this is what these synapses are called, adrenergic. Catecholamine family of molecules, we have tyrosine, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. These are just important because they're different neurotransmitters and also could possibly be hormones. And just to see what they look like, you can see how they all kind of are in the same class of families, and they just differ a little bit on this end kind of grouping there. Neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system, again, this is showing the sympathetic nervous system will always use acetylcholine and norepinephrine possibly, and the parasympathetic will always use acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. Varicosities are axons of postganglionic neurons that have various swellings. They form synapses in passant, that just means in passing. So sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons could innervate the same tissues, but will release different neurotransmitters depending on the type of synaptic transmission. And this is just a look at the release of different neurotransmitters, whether it's a synaptic vessel releasing norepinephrine or releasing acetylcholine. And you'll see here axons of a parasympathetic neuron will always release acetylcholine. Axons of a sympathetic neuron could release norepinephrine. So it's just showing how both neurons could innervate the same effector organ, and each, again, neurotransmitter would bind to a different receptor depending on what the neurotransmitter is, and they would have antagonistic effects. That just means opposite effects. The response to adrenergic stimulation, it can be epinephrine in the blood or norepinephrine. It could stimulate or inhibit depending on the receptors. So it'll stimulate your heart, it'll stimulate your eye to dilate. It'll inhibit bronchioles in the lungs or other blood vessels. It'll inhibit contraction and causes dilation of those structures. These are alpha and beta receptors. I won't ask you guys these questions. They all act using those G proteins, the second messenger system. And these are different effects in different organs, and they are adrenergic receptors. Response to adrenergic stimulation. These I won't ask you guys too much on. It takes you through the alpha to drugs that mimic these responses. Agonists are drugs that promote the process stimulated by the neurotransmitter, and antagonists will be drugs that block the actions of the neurotransmitter. So some drugs are useful in medical applications to either promote or block this neurotransmitter depending on what we want done. So these are different drugs that stimulate or drugs that block it. And you might recognize some of these drugs here. Nicotine, numerous toxic effects include first stimulation, then depression of all autonomic ganglia. So that is one that's commonly found in cigarette smoke. This is response to the cholinergic stimulation, and I won't ask you too many questions about this. Nicotinic would be a receptor found in autonomic ganglia. It's blocked by a drug called curare. These are more cholinergic receptors. Continued muscarinic are found in visceral organs and are stimulated by the release of acetylcholine. And this is just a general kind of what the type of receptor is, where it's found, and the response and mechanism. So you guys need to have a general understanding of these receptors, but not a lot of details. This is just a comparison of a nicotinic and muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So again, these are two types of acetylcholine receptors. One will have an excitation or an excitation and inhibition response. Receptor activity and autonomic regulation. This just takes you through kind of how the receptors are released, depending, and then what, based on what the receptor it is in the organ, it'll have a parasympathetic or sympathetic effect. Other autonomic neurotransmitters, some do not release acetylcholine or norepinephrine, and they can include ATP, vasoactive intestinal peptide, VIP, and nitric oxide, but the main ones are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. These are a couple other different fibers that I'll let you guys read through on your own. I really want you to understand, though, the general basics, differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and what neurotransmitters are important for each. Most visceral organs are innervated by both, and most of the time the systems are antagonists, so you should know which part of the ANS does both to increase heart rate and decrease it, digestive functions, and the pupil diameter, what the sympathetic will do and what the parasympathetic will do. They could have complementary effects will occur when both divisions produce similar effects. Like salivary gland secretion, the parasympathetic will stimulate secretion of saliva, and the sympathetic will constrict blood vessels, so the secretion could become thicker. Cooperative effects have to do with erection and ejaculation. So I'll let you guys read through what the parasympathetic and sympathetic do for that. Again, it's a cooperative effect. Continued urination is also a cooperative effect as well. So a summary of autonomic functions. Again, this is similar to that chart that I showed you before, but it's a great chart to look at to summarize what we just talked about. And you should have a general idea of what the parasympathetic and sympathetic autonomic nervous system does. Organs with dual innervation. These organs are innervated by the sympathetic division only. So you should know a general idea of the adrenal medulla, that's your fight or flight. The erector pili muscles in the skin give you goosebumps, sweat glands, and most blood vessels. And they're regulated by an increase or decrease in sympathetic nerve activity, and it's important for body temperature regulation. Many visceral functions are regulated by autonomic reflexes, and I'll let you guys read through this. Regulation of the medulla. Higher brain regions regulate the medulla, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, the cerebellum, and the frontal and temporal lobes. A great question might just be matching what these higher brain functions are to their function. Autonomic dysreflexia is a serious condition that can cause stroke. Pulmonary edema is swelling of the lungs, and MI is a heart attack in people with spinal cord injuries. Spinal shock may occur immediately after cord injury, after the T6 vertebra level, especially if the cord is completely transected or severed. At first, there will be a loss of spinal reflexes before the level of injury, but after some time, the reflexes, could reappear in an exaggerated state. In aging, is associated with increased levels of sympathetic activity, so there's increase of sympathetic tone, so that would cause constriction of different parts of the body, so this could increase risk for hypertension, increased blood pressure, and also cardiovascular diseases. These are sensory receptors that stimulate afferent or motor fibers in the vagus nerve, which will transmit to the medulla oblongata. Afferent is sensory fibers. And that's the end of this slideshow. So you should have a general understanding really well of the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. Thanks for listening, guys.